Hi everyone, and welcome to the Peanut Labs monthly webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available with all of our other webinars on the Peanut Labs website. After today, if you might be interested in our past webinars on integrating data quality measures into your questionnaires and how to sample the right percentages of people in your study. You can find these and a few others on our resources page. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and I'll save about 5 minutes at the end for questions. So please feel free to type any questions you might have along the way in the box at the side of your screen. So let's get started. Sampling is a hugely important part of the work that marketing researchers do. One little mistake here can completely change your results, your conclusions, and your recommendations. So today I'd like to talk about 10 things, including a few pet peeves of mine that I often see along the way. 10 things that we as researchers can do to sample better and ultimately generate better quality data and better quality recommendations. Now, the first thing you need to do is start with a SMART research objective. I know this sounds obvious, but this is often a very weak point of the work we do. Your research objective forms the basis of your entire project, and it's used to define every single aspect of your study. So a weak objective leads to a weak questionnaire that uses inappropriate sample and leads to vague conclusions and recommendations. It's really easy to dive into a study that simply aims to learn more about your brand. But an objective like that meets none of the criteria required for a SMART objective. We could refine that objective by saying we want to understand what brand users think about a brand, but that's still not nearly specific enough. It gets us closer, but really is not all the way there. It's not until we get to that last research objective that you see where we have enough specific criteria to plan a research project. That will also give us clear direction and clear conclusions and recommendations. So with this objective, we know that our sampling target is people who use a specific SKU and that they must use it at least once per week. This objective makes it clear that we should choose our sample with the use of a pre-screener. And this pre-screener needs to let us identify which SKUs people use and how often they use them. Now, once you have a SMART research objective, you will be able to identify your target group precisely. So using our example, we know we want to identify users of a specific SKU. Let's say it's dark roast coffee. As simple as that sounds, there are many ways to define that target group in a pre-screening question. You could simply ask, how often do you use dark roast coffee, and give a series of frequency options. Well, first of all, asking someone if they use coffee sounds really weird. You're going to confuse your respondents on the very first page of your questionnaire, and right off the bat, that just means bad data. Second of all, there actually are people who use coffee. You can ask your friends and colleagues to save their coffee grinds and give them to you, and then you can use the grinds to fertilize your garden. Or maybe you just put the coffee in the fridge to absorb food odors. Or you use it as an abrasive for cleaning around the house, or to dye your clothes, or to wash your hair, whatever it might be. For our purposes, I am pretty sure those are not the uses we're interested in. Another option is to ask people how often they buy dark roast coffee. Now, buying is a bit better, but same kind of thing, it is also not completely on the mark. This will pick up people who are using coffee to wash their face and their hair. And you'll find people who buy coffee for their spouse or their colleagues, but never for themselves. So a third, much better option is to ask people how much coffee they drink. Now that pre-screener will get you the sample you actually want. And while we're at it, you also need to think about the demographic characteristics of the sample you're going to target. Are you interested in census rep, including children who may drink coffee? Are you only interested in women? Are you only interested in seniors? When you know this kind of information, then you can visit the census website and get the exact target characteristics of that group. So for instance, DataFerret is a website that shares US Census data. You can use the data they have there to set up sampling targets that look exactly the same as census data. So now that we've decided who is in our sample, we also need to decide who is out of our sample. And as always, it's not as simple as you think. So once you know who you do want to talk to, it's really easy to ignore everyone else. But this is where you really need to pause. Don't just automatically exclude people because that's how you've always done this kind of research. You need to really think carefully about why you want to talk to users. Why do you only want to talk to high volume users? There's a lot to be learned from people who rarely use your product or never use your product. Same thing, what do competitive users dislike about your brand? And why do some people use so little of your brand? Every one of these groups of people could lead you towards important insights that could help you understand your brand better. So maybe the low volume users say your brand has too much caffeine, or they end up taking too many trips to the bathroom. Or the competitive users might say your brand is too expensive, or they can never find coupons. Now, all of these reasons are food for thought regarding your future plans. So don't exclude these people from your sample simply because that's how you've always done things. Simply because you forgot their opinions could offer important insights. I am a huge fan of my slow cooker, and I love how it turns the worst cut of meat into the most tender and delicious pulled pork. Is it dinner time? It must be dinner time. Well, the same thing applies in market research. You know that phrase, faster, cheaper, better? Well, faster is not better. When it comes to pulled pork and sampling, faster is worse. Getting in and out of field as fast as you can is a surefire way to bias your sample. So let's look at just the group of us sitting around listening to this webinar. I suspect that nearly all of us are at work, sitting in an office, at our desk. And nearly all of us do this every day. We arrive at 9 a.m., we stare at our computers for 8 hours, and then we go home at 5 p.m. But the rest of the world does not work like this. Highly educated, high-income people like doctors work night shifts, and they sleep during the day. Teachers and factory workers aren't allowed to touch their cell phones during the workday. So every time we launch surveys at 10 a.m. and download our data at 3 p.m., we've automatically excluded large groups of people from participating in online surveys. We have biased our sample and skewed our results. So the best thing you can possibly do is to keep your study open for a full week. That way you hit everyone. People who sleep during the day because they work the night shift, people who only get to a computer on weekends because they only have a tiny phone at home, and you'll also get keeners and slackers because every type of person makes up your population, not just keeners who are on the computer right this instant checking every social network at millisecond intervals. Now this next item is on a similar vein. Stay in field. If your plan was to stay in field for 7 days, then for sure stay in field for the full 7 days. But sometimes, even after you've been in field for the planned amount of time, Sometimes you'll find that your target groups, there's a few target groups that just aren't full. Maybe you were hoping to get 17 completes from 18 to 34-year-old men, but you only got 5. We've got a couple of options here. You could simply weight those 5 people so that statistically they look like 17 people. But it's a really bad idea to count each person as 3.5 people. Do you really think that 5 20-year-old men are enough to reasonably represent 20-year-old men? Are there only 5 personality types out there? Only 5 kinds of men who reflect the entire range of the 18 to 34-year-old's experience? Surely it is not. The other alternative is to stay in field. Actually, in this case, I'd say it's not an alternative. It is the only alternative. The only time it makes sense to close your fielding is when you've hit at least 90% of every target group. Then if you really have to weight a group up, at least the weights will be very small and your likelihood of biasing the results will be much less. Tell your kids to stay in school and tell yourself to stay in field. All right, the next item we must remember, and again, this seems really obvious, use a large sample size. In the market research space, we are very often guilty of using sample sizes that are far too small. So let's take this very simple example. We've got 2 different boxes of Honey Nut Cheerios here. If you look at the top box scores, the winning box is obvious. 30% of people like the first box and 43% of people like the second box. We clearly have to go with the second box. But if you didn't plan ahead and your sample size was only 200 per group, these 2 numbers are statistically equivalent. The margins of error are just too large. This difference could have easily happened by chance. But if we had started with sample sizes of 400 per group, then we wouldn't be worrying about whether the difference was likely to be real or likely to be chance. And while we're at it, we might start off with a total sample size that looks pretty good, but when you download your data and start looking at the subgroups, the sample sizes might no longer be sufficient. You really need to plan your sample sizes ahead of time, your analytical analyses ahead of time. So if you know you need to analyze opinions from women, then you need to ensure you have large enough samples for women, not just the overall sample. All right, the next item. People who work with panel and emailed survey invitations know this problem all too well. If you mail out 100 invitations to women and 100 invitations to men, you are going to receive back more completes from women pretty much every single time. And the same thing goes with many other groups of people as well. So we know that older people, white people, lower income people, they respond to emailed survey invitations at a much higher rate. And since you know this is going to happen, you can save yourself a bit of time by planning your sample to include higher numbers of those low responding groups at the very beginning. If you've seen that historically one group under-responds by about 10%, then be sure to oversample them this time by about 10%. This planning can save you a day, several days, by avoiding extended field times due to slow returns. Alrighty, next item. I've encountered this problem many times myself. I know exactly what target group I want to talk to, and I've designed the most perfect pre-screening questions. The grammar is impeccable. But when I get out of field, I realize that there are only 100 people in my most important target group. That's not nearly enough to generate reliable conclusions. So why did this happen even though I planned my overall sample size properly? The reason is I didn't design the pre-screening question properly. You see, there are many different definitions of what makes a heavy user or a loyal user. So in your opinion, a heavy user might be someone who drinks 10 or more cups of coffee per week. But if there aren't very many of those people and your sample sizes end up being too small, then you might as well not have done the research at all. All of your results could just be due to chance. So the wisest thing you can do is pre-test all of your most important questions to make sure you've identified the right group of people and that your target groups will end up including a large enough sample size at the end. So take the advanced time to test out 2 or 3 alternatives that will help you make sure you've got enough people in your important buckets at the end of your field time. All right, on to item number 9. Now, I know this one is hard to do. I have 0 experience running focus groups, so it would never occur to me to run a focus group. And other people are the exact opposite, and they would never think of running a large-scale survey. So here is the deal. Think about your research objective. What piece of information do you really need to know? Is it essential to collect opinions from a sample of 500 census rep people? Or do you need in-depth consideration from a sample of 30 people? Is it essential to use a client list? Or do you need to think outside of the list of people who signed up to get your newsletter? If you are able to brush aside your preferred method, the way you've always done things, to consider which method would best suit the specific needs of this research project, then you will be better able to choose the right sample and better able to collect quality data. And here we are on to item number 10, the last item I will mention today. This is another thing that we're not very good at dealing with. So like pretty much everyone else, we need our work to be error-free. Unfortunately, that is just never going to happen. Errors sneak into every research project from the very beginning of research design to the very last stage of report preparation. Now, I know we like to think our surveys are extremely well written, but I'm positive that every single person who takes our surveys could point out at least one question that they didn't understand or that they couldn't provide what they thought was the right answer to. No matter what type of sample we use, whether it's a probability sample, a non-probability sample, it will not be based on a perfectly inclusive population frame. No matter how hard you try, humans will exercise their right to decline to participate. They will quit participating halfway through, and it will not be a random group of people who decline or quit. We are also going to make errors as we edit and recode the data in SPSS or SAS. We're going to misinterpret statistics we run. We're going to use unclear language when we write a report. So the point here is every research project needs to consider total survey error, sampling error, non-sampling error, frame errors, response biases. And when you find out that something with your research didn't work out the way you had hoped, and guaranteed it will happen, be ready to think about every type of problem that may have arisen, not just the obvious ones, and be ready to deal with them. So, quick sum up here. I'm sure you've realized that many of the items I've addressed here are very closely related. Planning ahead will solve most of our problems. Uh, we need to make sure that every project we run has sufficient planning time, and this will help us avoid a lot of the headaches that result from poor target definitions, poor pre-screening questions, poor analytical planning, insufficient sample sizes, and more. And do take extra care to be aware of all the different types of error that can contribute to your research. If you do that, then you'll be better able to understand when and where and why you can generalize your results. Alrighty, so with that, I have reached the end of our 10 ways to sample better. I hope you heard a few interesting tidbits in there, and maybe you were able to figure out which of them were my pet peeves. If you have any questions, do feel free to type them in the box at the side of your screen. I'm going to take a quick scroll through it and see if there are any questions that I can answer. So just give me a minute here while I have a peek at what is going on. Okay, I have a question from Chris. Chris is asking, how do you know if you're getting a good sample? Okay, it's a very broad question. That's okay. The best thing you can do is to ask questions. Actually, the best thing you can do is go onto the ESMR website and get yourself a copy of ESMR's 28 questions to help buyers of online sample. It's a PDF. It goes through a whole series of questions that you should ask your supplier, and it tells you why those questions are important. So it gives you prompts like where do they recruit from, how do they target hard to reach people, what data quality processes do they use, how do they handle data security. There's a whole list of 28 things. So what you're really looking for is a supplier who's careful to include a wide range of people in their recruitment strategy. And you also need a supplier who is very diligent and strict about their data quality practices. You can't be in a situation where data quality happens at the beginning of the recruitment period and never again. So that's one thing you can avoid. Okay. Another question. Okay, there's lots of DIY sample now. Is it any good? Why, of course it is. The answer, I'll give you a similar answer as Chris. Not all sample is the same quality. So you really need to ask a lot of questions. The difference between good and bad sample is not whether it's self-serve or full serve. The difference is the care that happens behind the scenes, the stuff you don't even see. How do they handle recruiting and incenting people? How do they ensure their panel is as engaged as possible, within reason, obviously. So again, I highly advise getting your hands on the ESMR 28 questions documents. It's really helpful to help you figure out what's important in terms of getting quality sample. Another question. Every panel has strengths and weaknesses. How do you make your results most representative given the sample bias in a particular panel? Oh, very, very true. Every single panel, guaranteed, has its own bias. You can't really know what the bias is for a specific panel. What you can do is make sure that their recruitment strategy is very broad, that they don't focus it in just one single area. Just to make things like very simple, a very simple example, are they recruiting from one single website Or are they recruiting from hundreds or thousands of websites? It's very easy to get a bias sample if they're only pulling from one source. Much more difficult if they're pulling from hundreds of sources. So do look for that. And then in terms of general representativeness, I'm always a big fan of looking at data ferret to get US Census results. So oftentimes we're just focused on half men, half women. And that could be a fair point, but sometimes that's not who your population is. It actually could be 70% women or 70% men. It's really best to have a peek at data ferret and see what your population actually looks like. Let's see. Are there any reported statistics on whether increasing incentives increases data quality and recruitment? I will confess I do not know. Increasing incentives does increase click rates. I have not seen that it decreases data quality, but I haven't seen third-party reports looking at consistency among different panels if there is an overall decrease in data quality. That aside, I would still say I have a standard technique for how I run data quality. I do it on every single survey, standard, whether it was a high incentive, a low incentive, regardless of where the sample came from. I always have my standard process of how I run data quality. Actually, that's one of the webinars in the on the resources page. If that interests you, you can find that webinar there. But data quality is one of my fun things to do. Let's see if I got any other questions here. Okay, I think we're fairly good for questions. If you find that you've got any other questions after the fact, I am more than happy to answer any of them by email, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever works for you. You can probably catch me somewhere online. So thank you everyone for making the time to join me for the Peanut Labs webinar. I'm hoping, here's hoping, your sampling and non-sampling errors are minimal and that your next survey is the best survey you've ever written. Bye everyone.